Welcome back to OtakuDaiKun. Dai here. Let's go ahead and continue the lore of Lord el-melloi II Case Files. This is part 4 of a series, so be sure to watch the previous stuff first. Once again, huge shout out to Twilight's Call on Beast's Lair for translating this. Volume 4 is special in that it's one of the few parts of Case Files that was included in the anime. It revolves around the Mystic Eye Train Rail Zeppelin, and while you can watch this entire volume in anime form, I hope you'll find value in today's video because I'll be pointing out details that weren't included in that adaptation. Admittedly, the anime is a bit difficult to comprehend anyway, so this video will provide further clarification. The prologue begins with Gray narrating an experience with Waver. His student, Sven, has just been promoted to the rank of Pride. This is a huge deal, since it's extremely rare for a mage to reach the Pride, or Law rank, before the age of 20. Aside from Sven, the only other mage to achieve this was Waver's master Kenneth. As a reminder, mages at the Clock Tower are separated into one of 7 ranks. Proper demonstration of their abilities can have a mage advance from rank 7 upwards toward rank 1, also known as Grand or Crown. Very few mages have accomplished this, and even Waver himself is only rank 4, or Fez. That alone isn't too surprising, since Waver makes a better teacher than a mage. But still, it's impressive to see one of his students ascend to a rank higher than his own. Thus, as proud as Waver is for producing talented students, he can't help but be envious of them, as he's unable to achieve what they can. Regardless, upon returning to his apartment from the ceremony, Waver pours himself some alcohol and tells Gray about his past. Initially, after surviving the Fourth Holy Grail War, he didn't want to go back to the Clock Tower, at least not immediately. Instead, he traveled through India and Persia, taking a visit to Macedonia. He wanted to check out Iskandar's old stomping grounds, you know? As he was all by himself, it wound up being a humbling experience. His bag was stolen, and he even had to use some sneaky magecraft to get out of a fight with a gang. Surviving on his own like this made the Clock Tower seem much more bearable. Regardless, Waver enjoyed his time in Greece. The drink he's having right now actually came from Greece, reminding him of the Mediterranean Sea. He got his first experience teaching in Greece after discovering the region's second owner. This is another interesting mage term. Second owners are mages put in charge of supervising valuable places across the earth. For example, the Tosaka family happens to be the second owner of Fuyuki in Japan. The Aozakis oversee Misaki Town in Japan, and the Yugada Millennia family oversees Trifas in Romania. When Waver met the second owner in Greece, he taught the mage's sons for a time, giving him the confidence needed to teach at the Clock Tower. Taking a break from the conversation, Gray warns Waver to stop drinking, though he remarks how Rhinus drank 10 times more just earlier. In Britain, kids as young as 5 could drink alcohol with a guardian's supervision, so Rhinus is quite used to holding her liquor during social gatherings. Apparently, she's so good at it that she can outdrink all of Waver's students. Regardless, Gray takes away Waver's booze, and he soon falls asleep on the sofa. From within his cage, Ad jokingly provokes Gray to take advantage of her master with a kiss on the lips, but she forcibly shuts him up as usual. Instead, she drapes a blanket over Waver and stays the night at his place so she can be ready to untangle his hair in the morning. Chapter 1 begins on a cold day in November. Gray is curious to try skating at the ice rink near the Museum of Natural History, but reasons she has no time for that. On her way to school, she takes one of those red double-decker buses. She's always found them cute, but when she first came to London, she was too afraid of crowds to actually ride one. She's become a bit braver after interacting with Sven and Flat. Nearing campus, Gray notices a bounded field, recalling how Waver taught her to break bounded fields through meditation. Entering the main Norwich building, Gray finds Rhinus, and the two of them wait for Waver's current lecture to finish. There's a new student in his class, Cowless Forveg. Now, you may recognize this guy from Fate Apocrypha. In that timeline, various struggling families allowed themselves to be absorbed into the larger Yugada Millennia faction, but that doesn't come to pass in the timeline of Fate Stay Night, where today's story takes place. Instead, Cowless becomes one of Waver's students. What stays the same in both timelines, however, is that Cowless takes over the family's magecraft for his sister Fiore. Of the two of them, Fiore was born with amazing magical circuits, but also suffered from paralysis in her legs. Because of this, Fiore's parents thought it would be a good idea to birth a second heir, but by comparison, Cowlus wound up being rather mediocre. Thus, Fiore reluctantly remained the heir despite not having what it takes emotionally to be a mage. That's why, even though he's inferior, Cowlus ultimately inherits the family crest so that his sister can live outside the world of magecraft. Looking from afar, Rhinus notices that Cowlus is holding one of the primeval batteries used by Atram Galliasta during the Twin Towers of Iselma incident. Waver explains that, apparently, Atram never filed a patent for his primeval batteries. As such, Waver is researching the theory behind it, and is using Cowlus for his affinity for electricity spells. Doing this is quite brazen for a mage, though. Obviously, if a mage doesn't patent their work, it means they want to keep it a secret for themselves. Yet here Waver is trying to reverse engineer how Atram's spell works. To be fair, this isn't something Waver would ever be able to do on his own. It's only thanks to having Flat analyze the spell during combat that this is even an option. Despite trying to pry into the secrets of Atram's magecraft, it seems the Middle Eastern oil baron has taken an interest in Waver, visiting from time to brag about his achievements. In other words, Waver's walking a risky tightrope, remaining in close contact with the mage he's trying to expose. Even so, if Atram tries to retaliate, Gray promises to protect him. Breaking the tension, another new student of Waver's enters the fray. Yvette L. Lehrman has just transferred from the Faculty of Mineralogy to study with him. She calls herself the Mystic Eye Girl, a lone flower with pink hair and a bubbly personality. Yvette introduces herself while teasing Waver about his ever-increasing harem of disciples, but he brushes it off to prepare for his next lesson. In his private office, Waver tells Gray that the first time he met Yvette, she declared herself a spy for the Melloi faction. As a reminder, the Clock Tower has 3 major factions. There's the aristocratic faction headed by the Melloi, the democratic faction headed by the Trembelio, and the neutralist faction headed by the Melloi. Technically, the el-melloi are affiliated with the aristocrats, and since Waver's class has proven to be so influential, it only makes sense that the other factions would want to keep an eye on him. Specifically, mineralogy used to be Kenneth's department, but following his death, the Melloi family took over. They expected the el-melloi family to crumble, but Waver prevented that, so Yvette may be looking to bridge some kind of peace between them. Gray has noticed Waver acting rather strange lately. She points out that his hours are being reduced, and he stopped lecturing at the Clock Tower's main building altogether. She asks if it has something to do with the upcoming Fifth Grail War, and Waver angrily shouts in denial. After a moment, though, he calms down, apologizes, and explains that his most prized possession, the shroud he used to summon Iskandar, has been stolen. He kept the catalyst in a double-locked safe, but now it's gone, and in its place is a letter inviting him to attend a banquet on the Mystic Eye collecting train, Rail Zeppelin. Once a year, the Rail Zeppelin runs through Europe, collecting Mystic Eyes to sell off at an auction. This is a huge deal for collectors, but the more amazing aspect is that Rail Zeppelin is one of the only places a mage can have Mystic Eyes transplanted in them. That is, without fear of bodily rejection. Normally, Mystic Eyes are a product of birth, or something one obtains spontaneously throughout their life. One does not simply install a Mystic Eye from someone else, but the Rail Zeppelin is so far the only exception. Waver continues to lecture Gray on the importance of eyes in magecraft. Apparently, sight is the first magecraft in human history. It's the most valued among the 5 bodily senses, and as such has been the focus of many long-held beliefs. For instance, the sun and moon are regarded as the eyes of heaven, as seen in the Eye of Horus from Egypt. Hurricanes are described through having the eye of the storm, and we see this destructive association with the evil eye of the Celtic king Balor, as well as the one-eyed Norse god Odin. Volcanoes are seen as evil eyes of the earth, extending to the dangerous eyes of earth goddesses like Medusa. Even black holes in space are associated with eyes, paralleling the ancient concept of Mahakala, the Great Void. Mages can create low-ranked mystic eyes on their own, but the real deal is something mages are born with. Due to its dangerous nature, not even the greatest mage families attempt to transplant them without the Rail Zeppelin's aid. For a time, the train confined itself to Scandinavia, but a certain incident interrupted its auction, and from then on, it began to show up more frequently throughout Europe. Basically, Toko Aozaki, who we met in the previous 2 volumes, went on the hunt for a dead apostle named Rita Rose N. Rita was the original owner of Rail Zeppelin, but disappeared when Toko attacked, and the train was destroyed in the process. Since then, Rail Zeppelin has been rebuilt and is presided over by a shadowy emanation of Rita. Other than that, there are almost no records of mages actually boarding the train, making Waver's invitation quite shocking. He plans to go to obtain Iskandar's shroud, and he asks Gray to accompany him. The next day, Rhinus brings Gray to a sweets shop. Gray asked her for advice, only to be confronted by an absolute treasure trove of decadent chocolates. The flavor is almost too delicious for Gray to handle without tapping her feet with glee. After savoring Gray's cuteness, Rhinus explains that the Rail Zeppelin is known for sending 2 different kinds of invitations, one for buyers and the other for sellers. In some cases, mages obtain mystic eyes that are too much for them to control. This is more harm than help, and so these mages sell their eyes to release that burden. One might think that Rhinus would want to get rid of her eyes, since they cause her pain when reacting to dense surges of mana. However, while they are an inconvenience at times, she has no desire to part with them. They're useful in their own way, and she likes how jealous Waver is of them. Also, invitations to the train extend to parties of 3, meaning that even if Gray comes along, Waver can bring a 3rd companion. At the moment, Flat is on leave to his hometown of Monaco, and Sven has ceremonies to attend to regarding his promotion. Other potential candidates include the Pentel sisters, students of Waver's who can harmonize their mana with each other, or perhaps the student Roland Perjinsky, who isn't elaborated on at all. That said, Waver doesn't exactly like involving his students in these matters. To make matters worse, his newest student, Yvette, is technically a suspect regarding who stole Iskandar's catalyst, though Rhinus isn't especially worried about that. One reason for this is that Iskandar's shroud, while capable of summoning the King of Conquerors, isn't a magical artifact like, say, the leaf on Siegfried's back. Outside of a Grail War, it doesn't really hold any inherent power. Rhinus has her own reasons for prying into this matter. She's doing business with a tuner named Melvin Wines, a mage from the Trembelio faction in the Department of Creation. Tuners are a rare breed of mage that specialize in tuning magic crests and augmenting circuits. They are able to help mages transplant their crests by alleviating painful and permanent damage from a body's rejection of the crest. They also help with the recovery of lost magic crests, which is an important asset for the el-mellois. Note that while I refer to Waver by his birth name, everyone else in this story refers to him as Lord el-melloi II, or in Gray and Rhinus's case, Master and Brother respectively. Melvin Wines knew Waver from way back, and is one of the only people still calling him by that name despite inheriting the el-melloi title. It was also Melvin who funded Waver's little excursion to the Far East. Given the locations Waver went through, it was pretty easy for Rhinus to figure out that his servant in the Grail War was Iskandar. She gives a bit of a lore dump on him, though it's nothing I haven't already mentioned in my own Iskandar lore video. All in all, Rhinus decides to help out this time, promising to look into the missing shroud while Gray and Waver handle the Rail Zeppelin itself. Before taking off, she gives Gray a black credit card and a cell phone, expecting they will come in handy. She tells Gray to hold out for as long as possible before giving the credit card to Waver on the train. Chapter 2 brings us to an abandoned train station, late on a foggy night. Ultimately, the 3rd member to join Waver's crew is Cowless, who apparently heard about the train through a spell that Flat forgot to dismantle before leaving London. As the 3 of them break into the station, ignoring the blockades, Cowless expresses his own inadequacy. He hopes to make up for his poor natural abilities with study and knowledge. He can't afford mystic eyes for himself, but he nonetheless wants to see Rail Zeppelin. In preparation, Waver gathered money in secret to purchase a pair of glasses, Mystic Eye Killers, that will help him nullify the effects of other people's eyes. It's the least he can do to protect himself given their destination. Approaching the platform, Waver notes other guests who have also been invited. Of them, he discovers Hishiri Adashino, the Japanese woman from the Faculty of Law. We first met her in Volume 1 with the Castle Adra. She claims she's here for her own personal reasons, rather than as a representative of the clock tower. Another voice introduces herself. So far, you probably know more from Fate Grand Order, but it's a younger Olga Marie Asmlate Animesphere, around age 11 or so. Being rather rude and confrontational, she calls Hishiri a rat from Law and Waver the trophy husband of Norwich. On this timeline, Olga's father Marisbury is still alive and the head of the astrology department, making her the family's heir. Olga is on the defensive, not willing to reveal her motive for coming, even though Waver admits if they both happen to be after different things, it might actually relieve their tension. Olga is joined by an older woman named Trisha Fellows, who introduces herself as Olga's attendant. Gray notices an accessory slipping down from the hem of Trisha's coat, something that looks rather lewd from a distance. Waver actually appreciates Olga's brutal honesty. It's easier to deal with than people who hide their true feelings, which is normally how mages operate. That said, it's unusual for the Animespheres to leave their territory in the mountains, making Olga's appearance suspicious. From the mystical fog in the distance, the sound of a steam whistle rings out, followed by the rail Zeppelin itself. Its doors open, and the guests step inside, where they are greeted by the smell of fresh fruit. They spot a man eating an apple beside a table arranged ornately with colorful fruits. Waver asks if the man is part of the train staff, to which he denies, instead putting his hand to his chest, in a pose that Cowlus recognizes from a TV show called Jean Mario's Zombie Cooking. Called out, the man whips out 2 handguns, spins them around, tosses them behind his back, and strikes a dramatic pose. The guy's the host of a show from London's minor broadcasting office, where he cooks food while gunning down a horde of zombies. Waver doesn't know this show, because his TV is used exclusively for gaming. Gray finds it strange that a mage would be on TV, but Jean Mario explains that it's not unheard of. The Faculty of Botany's Archelot also happens to dabble in televised media. Waver's attention shifts to a different man seated at the other end of the table. An old guy in his 70s with a scar between his brow introduces himself as Carabo Frampton, a member of the Holy Church. Everyone but Jean Mario tenses up, because the Church and Mages Association are lifelong enemies. Basically, the Church aims to eliminate all mystery that doesn't align with their beliefs, which is obviously a problem for most mages. On the verge of a sudden fight, the tension is lifted once more when Yvette shows up. As a family renowned for its mystic eyes, the Lairmen happen to be regulars on the rail Zeppelin. She rants about being Waver's new prospective lover, and how bringing Cowlus along counts as cheating. Or does it count as cheating if it's a gay romance? While Yvette declares she isn't up for a 3-way, Waver swears while placing his hand to his face. He asks where this whole lovers thing comes from, and she says she decided it just now from the depths of her heart. She invites Waver to touch her, calling him a lolicon, and he responds by demanding she leave, preferably through the window. Soon, a thin man in a black suit emerges. Looking down at a silver pocket watch, he introduces himself as Rodin, the train's conductor. Staying on schedule, the train begins to move, and he announces their plan to circle London over the next 4 days and 3 nights. On the 3rd day, an auction will be held for their collection of mystic eyes, upon which winners can either take possession of their eyes or get them immediately transplanted. All mystic eyes being offered up need to be presented by the day before the auction. Appearing beside Rodin, a woman named Leandra offers to answer any other questions. It seems both Rodin and Leandra were stealthy. Nobody noticed them come in despite their flashy attire. Of them, Leandra has a strip of leather wrapped around her eyes. If Gray hadn't known about the Princess of Silver and her blindness, Leandra's own lack of sight would have been more alarming. Every invitation corresponds to one elegant guest room with 3 beds, so Waver, Gray, and Cowlus are escorted to their own private quarters. There, Gray is rendered a bit dizzy by all the new people she just met. Unlike earlier incidents, so many of these guests have a personal connection to them. Waver admits he should have expected Yvette's attendance. After all, she wears an eye patch, And beneath that patch isn't an actual eye, but rather a jewel. It's an artificial mystic eye, and her family specializes in creating them. They function on par with noble-colored mystic eyes. In other words, they're practically like proper mystic eyes, which is impressive. The Lehrman family must visit the rail Zeppelin often to acquire more eyes to further their research in creating artificial ones. Sadly, the actual manager of the train hasn't appeared yet, leaving Waver no means of tracking down his precious catalyst. He's not really all that sure why he was invited in the first place, so all he can do is observe the process for now. While Waver heads to sleep, Callus remarks how impressive Gray is for keeping her cool throughout all of this. In exchange, Gray notes how Callus was ready to fight before Yvette showed up. He explains how he learned to defend himself after his sister decided to abandon magecraft. While he was willing to take the role of heir, his inferior abilities angered the family, to the point where they thought they could force his sister to return if they killed him. The two of them find common ground in the fact that both of their lives were tossed into chaos by grand expectations placed upon them. Callus also has a lot in common with Waver, in that both of them struggle with inadequacy. Thus, Gray comforts Callus by saying Waver wouldn't have brought him along if he weren't capable of becoming strong. After a warm conversation, they also decide to sleep through the night. Come morning, breakfast is being served in the dining hall. Waver asks Gray to go on ahead of him so he can investigate the train while everyone's busy eating. In the dining cab, Yvette beckons Gray to sit with her. At the car's center is a transparent tube containing a pair of eyes suspended in liquid. Leandra introduces them as the mystic eyes of incineration, which can, as the name implies, ignite people in flames just by looking at them. Along with breakfast, guests are given hardcover books detailing the specifications for all the eyes being showcased for the auction. Having a pair of eyes in the center of the room is a bit off-putting, but Gray notes she's gotten so used to seeing morbid things that she doesn't even know how to react to horror movies with wryness. I imagine ghosts are a different story, though. The auction will feature a total of 4 sets of mystic eyes, which Yvette claims is normal for the train. She remarks that, originally, these auctions were done mainly as a means for the previous owner to show off her collection to other mages, and that the more exciting eyes are being saved for tomorrow. To that, Gray finds it unnerving to acknowledge the owner was a dead apostle. Yvette suspects that Carabo, the church guy, is here as a seller. At his old age, the odds of him trying to acquire a new pair of eyes are low. Mystic eyes are special in that they have their own magic circuits, which is what allows them to be transplanted in the first place. This makes them much more versatile than magic crests, which can only be passed down to compatible bloodlines. This means that the biggest downside of mystic eyes comes from controlling them, and it happens to be a lot easier for young people to adapt to powerful eyes. Because the train offers lower-ranked eyes, and even ordinary ones, it allows older mages to downgrade for their health and sanity. On the opposite end, strong mages are often confident enough that they can adapt the circuits of mystic eyes as their own. Of the guests present, Yvette suspects that Olga would have no issue controlling a set of mystic eyes, as she's the young daughter of a lord. While the rail Zeppelin seems like a valuable place for both aspiring and veteran mages, it can often be a major threat as well. Mages who already possess valuable mystic eyes may receive an invitation to sell them. Ignoring this summons sometimes results in said mages being found dead, with their eyes gouged out anyway. To them, that invitation is more of a decree stating, "Give up your eyes if you want to keep living." At this point, Waver enters the dining hall and joins them at the table. After speaking with the staff, Waver learned that his invitation is the kind that is often given out to new invitees. That said, the staff were unable to determine who sent it. In the distance, Leandra beckons forth a different pair of eyes, the mystic eyes of plunder. Magically, information on these eyes suddenly appears on a blank page in their books. These gold-ranked eyes are able to drain the life force from those they gaze upon. While that is quite impressive, the eyes are also quite old and have a tendency to retaliate against those who possess them. Since previous owners have nearly been killed by these eyes, Leandra advises potential buyers to check their liability clause in the contract. Watching this, Waver elaborates further that another risk of buying mystic eyes like this is the association. If you get powerful enough with them, you may wind up earning a sealing designation. If the eyes are rare enough and occur in you naturally, the association might decide not just to take possession of your eyes, but also your whole body along with them to preserve the miracle. Mystic eyes of the noble colors are already a step above the rest, but there are 3 special types they can also fall into. In this case, a lot of the strongest eyes shine gold and are labeled accordingly. One step up, there are jewel-ranked eyes, which are considered so rare that they only come from beings like heroic spirits from the Age of Gods. They no longer occur naturally, making them highly coveted. Yvette suspects that if they're rolling out gold eyes on day 1, they might actually reveal some jewel-ranked ones on day 2. Also, take note that it gets confusing in English, because while I said Yvette has a jewel for an eye that functions like a mystic eye, that is a literal jewel, and not the same thing as a pair of mystic eyes classified as jewel rank. Please try not to mix up the two. Olga, however, seems most interested in the 3rd and most powerful category, rainbow-colored mystic eyes, such as the mystic eyes of death perception. Such eyes are considered on par with the gods, and Olga assumes that Zeppelin must have some of them on board. Leandra responds ambiguously, stating she cannot comment on the matter, neither confirming nor denying the possibility. It's an exciting prospect, since rainbow eyes are only rumored to exist, with the discovery of eyes of death perception in Japan still not being fully accepted in the community. After breakfast, Waver and Gray meet Cowless back in their room with a newfound sense of dread. Apparently, while Cowless was watching over the room, someone snuck a note under the door and escaped before he could see who it was. The note thanks Waver for having accepted the invitation, but before anyone can read further, Olga comes to the door, wanting to discuss the Holy Grail. Given that Waver was actually a participant, it makes him the best person to talk to. The scene suddenly shifts to Hishiri Arashino. As you might recall, she is a member of the Faculty of Law, a unique part of the clock tower charged not with academic study, but with maintaining control over the other faculties. They have 3 main goals: to preserve the world of magecraft, to control other magi, and to mediate between mages and the ordinary world. Hishiri reflects on Olga's words and the idea of rainbow mystic eyes. Right now, they're mainly a rumor, but if such eyes actually exist, it could disrupt order in the clock tower, creating an imbalance of power. With no actual proof of their existence, Hishiri considers how insanely strong the mystic eyes of death perception would be. Similar to the Celtic god Balor, these eyes specialize in seeing the innate flaws of all things. Such an ability would be worth more than any mystic code possessed by the 12 families of the clock tower. Back to Waver's room, Olga and her attendant Trisha take a seat on the sofa. What business do the Animospheres have with the Holy Grail War? Typically, they're more concerned with observing the stars from their mountain territory. Well, they've been keeping an eye on the el-mellois since Kenneth died. Despite that tragedy, here Waver is, the family's successor, applying to participate in the next Grail War. Olga's trying to discern what Waver's motivation for doing so is, but that's not her main objective. She suspects Waver's on the train to gather resources for the next war. Since he wasn't selected as one of the clock tower's 2 official representatives, she thinks he's trying to secure the means to enter as a free agent, which isn't easy. When Kenneth entered the 4th Grail War, he squandered so much of the family's wealth. He put in dozens of mystic codes, jewels, minerals, evil spirits, and even 2 mystic furnaces into establishing his home base, only for Kiritsugu to blow the entire thing up in one go. That makes Waver's eagerness to rejoin all the more suspicious. As a fellow member of the aristocratic faction, Olga thinks they can work together. While the el-mellois are certainly part of the aristocracy, Waver himself had a humble birth, and if not for his unique circumstances, he would certainly be on the democratic side of things. That's why the Valualetta wanted to convince him to switch sides in the previous incident. Olga's already made it clear that she's gunning for some rainbow mystic eyes. She assumes Waver isn't interested in those, so at least their interests don't conflict. Of course, any mage would normally want such rare eyes, but she assumes the el-melloi couldn't possibly afford them. Ouch. Waver counters by wondering how Olga is so confident the train even has rainbow eyes, to which Trisha declares she's seen them herself. Beneath her glasses, Trisha Fellows has her own pair of mystic eyes. To demonstrate, she has Waver raise his right hand for 8 seconds. At the same time, Callus just so happens to fall off the bed, accidentally launching an empty kettle with his flailing. Right on time, the kettle lands perfectly in Waver's hand. Turns out, Trisha's eyes predict the future, the mystic eyes of foresight. She claims she saw a vision of rainbow eyes being put on display for this upcoming auction. Waver has his doubts, as there's a difference between a future that is possible and one that is fixed. If all that Trisha's eyes do is predict the future, then all she's seeing is just one possibility that might not come true, especially when that future is made known ahead of time. That said, she has reason to believe her vision, considering the auctioneer didn't deny the idea. Thus, Olga asks Waver to help her out. If the eyes do go on auction, and one of the other guests makes a bid for it, she wants him to intentionally outbid them. She did say the el-mellois don't have enough money, but she's saying that as heir to another lord. Other mages likely won't have that info, and will back down from challenging a lord like him to a bidding war. This would allow Olga to sweep in and claim the eyes for herself without as much opposition. Waver says he understands, but won't make any promises, which for now, Olga accepts. Before they leave, Trisha asks to stay behind and talk to Waver in private. When Olga returns to her room, Trisha pries further about the Holy Grail War. Unlike Olga, who suspects Waver wants to fight again for the sake of honor, Trisha properly guesses that Waver is entering again to meet his servant once more. To that, she asks what he will do if Iskandar doesn't remember their time together. From her experience as a necromancer, she theorizes that when heroic spirits are summoned consecutively, they don't travel with their memories of previous incarnations. Their recording in the Throne of Heroes likely has those memories, but not the version that gets summoned. Freshly summoned servants only have their memories from life, as well as knowledge the throne gives them to function in the modern era. She claims this is a safety measure, because the throne records data from the past, present, and future. If a servant could enter a war with knowledge of their previous incarnations, that means they would already know about their current incarnation, creating a paradox. This means that Artoria, being a living counter-guardian, must be an exception. I imagine that being more like one long, continuous summon. Instead of returning to the throne between summons, Artoria returns to the hills of Camlon, where she made her pact with the planet. Anyway, Trisha clarifies that this is just her theory, but she assumes that unless Waver can do something drastic like alter the summoning formula, or manipulate reality through a bounded field or singularity, his plan to reunite with his servant is fruitless. To that end, she implores Waver to focus on the rainbow eyes, and not be tempted by other possibilities that might help him with his goal. Trisha then leaves, and Gray tears up, worrying on Waver's behalf. He assures Gray that, as a lord studying the Grail War, he knew about servants not remembering past summons for a while now. He acts like this doesn't bother him, to which Callus suggests how painful it must be to meet someone who doesn't remember you. Waver agrees, but declares that he still wants to meet Iskandar, even if that's the case. He has things that he wants to confirm and achieve before he can put the past behind him. After speculating whether Olga is the culprit who invited him, they look back at the note slid beneath their door. The rest of it tells Waver to head to the caboose at night. Ooh. Before evening comes, however, the rail Zeppelin makes a scheduled stop for 2 hours. During that time, the guests are free to leave the train, though it's not like they've stopped at a proper station. Instead, outside is simply a forest where they can get fresh air. Stepping out for a bit, Waver's group discovers a small clearing of mushrooms growing in a circle. Waver calls it a fairy circle, which Yvette corroborates by explaining the rail Zeppelin's tracks follow mana ley lines. When the train stops, it's usually at a concentrated spot, so finding a trace of mystery like this isn't too surprising. While everyone discusses the remnants of fairies, Gray spots between the trees a woman standing among bright roses. The others can't see it, but when Gray describes what she saw, the conductor, Rodin, tells her that's the manager's representative, the emanation of Rita. She watches over the train, and it seems only Gray can see her due to a sensitivity that transcends ordinary mages. Just as Rodin is about to explain the train's past incident with Toko, Olga screams, and it rings out from within the train. Everyone present rushes to Olga's room, where they discover the gruesome sight of Trisha's headless body. Traumatized, Olga struggles to explain that she only stepped out for a breather and to grab some tea, but by the time she came back, Trisha was already like this. Chapter 3 begins with a short interlude regarding Karabo Frampton. As assumed, he does have a pair of mystic eyes. They are known as the mystic eyes of transience, and they grant him retrocognition. Long before he understood what mystic eyes even were, he'd see visions of the past through floating bubbles. We return to the scene of the crime. Olga is still horrified, in denial of what just happened to her beloved mentor. She lashes out at Waver and the others, angry about Trisha's death and demanding they give her back. Even though she's the daughter of a lord, she's still only around 11 years old, so this pain is perfectly understandable. Desperate to vent her frustration, she tries to pin the blame on Karabo Frampton, but he refuses the accusation. Instead, he offers to perform an autopsy. The conductor allows for this as long as Karabo can finish it quickly. Rail Zeppelin's concern is less about the murder and more about cleaning the mess and sticking to schedule. Hearing this, Olga attacks him by firing an invisible shot from her hand. Before it can strike the conductor, though, Karabo deflects the shot with one of his black keys. He then knocks Olga out with the handle of his blade and places her on the sofa. In peace, Karabo begins his assessment, declaring that, as one might expect, Trisha died from the loss of her head, passing instantly sometime within the past 10 or 20 minutes. Waver adds that the killer must have stolen the head because of Trisha's mystic eyes of foresight. But why remove an entire head just to steal mystic eyes? Can that even be done? When asked, Leandra affirms that so long as the culprit uses the same process Rail Zeppelin does, then yes, removing the eyes would be easy enough. That said, finishing the transplant outside the train would prove much riskier. As Karabo resumes his autopsy, the other mages present leave the room. That is, except for Gray, Waver, and Cowless. Gray asks Karabo if he hates Magi, and if so, why bother helping out like this? He confirms that he does in fact loathe mages, and would love to send them all to purgatory, but his black keys aren't meant to slay children in mourning. Shifting the conversation, Waver brings up Karabo's eyes, and the theory that he's selling them at the auction. Perhaps these same eyes happen to be handy in performing the autopsy. Conceding to Waver's sound reasoning, Karabo admits his eyes are the mystic eyes of hindsight. I said transience before, but this current translation goes with hindsight, so I guess I'll stick with that going forward. Karabo assumes his eyes might be of a noble color, but certainly nothing on par with gold or rainbow. To demonstrate his ability, Karabo describes how Gray fixed Waver's hair before breakfast, and that it's something the both of them are used to. Karabo can see the past, but he doesn't get to observe whatever time or place he wants. Since the eyes have grown out of control, he indeed plans to sell them at the auction. Sadly, he can't use his eyes to see the murderer, and is only able to view up to when Trisha sat down in the room. It's possible the culprit had protection against clairvoyance. That would make sense because, without that protection, Trisha would have probably been able to see her own death coming and avoid it. Of course, Karabo could be lying about his abilities, but Waver wants to trust him, claiming to be a decent judge of character. Rewarding Waver's trust, Karabo explains how his eyes are a detriment. When he is flooded with images of the past, it prevents him from focusing on the present, and mediating the two becomes impossible. Just as Olga starts to wake up, Karabo bids the group farewell. Coming to terms with what has transpired, Olga tries to act grown up, saying Trisha's death should have been expected. Magus children are often forced to mature quickly, and it reminds Gray of how Rhinus used to eat emergency rations out of fear of being poisoned. Waver tells Olga that they can arrange another room for her, but she writes that off as one aristocrat trying to curry favor from another. He clarifies his intentions are pure, citing some advice he once received about inexperience being the sign of a leader. The glory of seeking what lies beyond the horizon means he won't take advantage of Olga and her inexperience, especially since he was in the same boat once. That principle is more important to Waver than his status as a lord or playing into the clock tower's drama. After some discussion, Olga learns that Waver picked up this from his servant in the Grail War, and mocks him for it. Heroic spirits are supposed to be tools, fake copies of a hero that conform to the master, not the other way around. Waver doesn't take offense to her lashing, and instead proceeds to have the staff arrange a room for her next to his in case she's ever in trouble. As Waver leaves, he asks Cowlus to look after her. For as defensive as Olga is, it does seem like she appreciates the concern. Naturally, the other passengers have locked themselves in their rooms, ready to defend themselves now that a genuine threat has emerged. During this time, Jean Mario reaches out to Hishiri Adashino with a clue regarding the murder. He invites her into his room and offers her some wine, but she's not up for formalities. Cutting to the chase, Jean Mario claims he's seen the killer's methods before. 7 years ago, there was a serial killer who took their victims' heads. The incident never became public because the clock tower covered it up, meaning it might be something Hishiri recalls as part of the Faculty of Law. Unfortunately, she hasn't been in the faculty quite that long, and as an unrelated party, she wouldn't be able to access that information anyway. It seems this case 7 years ago is of some personal importance to Jean Mario. He explains that his family is second-rate in magecraft, but his TV career has allowed him to acquire various talismans and catalysts. Thus, he owes his television colleagues a great debt, and one of them, a news announcer, was involved in covering up the killings. As a show of his abilities, Jean Mario spills a drop of wine on his jacket, causing a swarm of spider familiars to crawl out from his sleeve to drink up the wine without it staining. These familiars are one thing, but if he wants to grow as a mage, he needs the kind of power that some valuable mystic eyes can grant him. Thus, by coming clean about his knowledge of the case 7 years ago, he hopes to strike a bargain with the Faculty of Law, aiming for both of them to team up for the auction. Come evening, Waver and Gray make their way to the deck of the train's final car, where the note told them to meet up. All in all, Rail Zeppelin is made up of 12 cars, including the front locomotive. Reaching the back meant crossing through 2 freight cars filled with boxes that passengers aren't supposed to see. From the meeting place, one can view the forest, as well as the fog that surrounds it. Waver reasons there's no way to escape from that fog, nor would it be easy to try and board the train outside of designated stops. Gray suggests the prospect of flying away, or at least using a floating spell, like the one she's heard about from one of her teachers, Professor Craig. Waver clarifies that even though such a spell is simple and taught during basic fundamentals, using it to float someone of human weight would be a strain on one's mana supply, though there are exceptions, such as witches floating on broomsticks. Such a feat can be achieved through black magic by rubbing an ointment on someone to prevent their feet from touching the ground. However, because such a witch's ointment doubles as a narcotic, it would be hard for even a witch to fly out of this dense fog while remaining clear-headed. In other words, flight just isn't feasible or efficient enough for mages in the modern era, not for long periods of time anyway. Suddenly, Gray notices something approaching them, followed by the arrival of lightning. Atop the rear car, a woman in her 20s steps forward, clad in leather armor and a short sword. In an antagonistic tone, she tries to decide if it's admirable or foolish for them to have shown up, given the possibility this was all a trap. Gray asks the woman if she stole Waver's relic, and she confidently declares she's a follower of the thief. Gray starts to pick a fight, but Waver stops her to ask the mysterious woman's identity. Instead, the woman takes a look at Waver with disgust, calling him an unkempt man with false pride who struggles to wake up in the morning. She claims she's already sick of seeing that kind of face on Eumenides, and she doesn't like seeing it on Waver either. The mentioning of Eumenides makes him go stiff. The woman clarifies that she was expecting better from a man who he had served under for a time, at least someone close to the level of Aristotle or Amon's priest. Clearly, Waver understands enough about what the woman is saying to render him shocked. Gray steps in to protect Waver as the woman deems him a disappointment, kicking off the roof to attack. Activating Add, Gray draws out her scythe to counter the woman's blade. They fight, making Gray feel like she's on some kind of ancient battleground. Her instincts tell her to flee, but she refuses to back down. After some thought, Waver reasons their opponent is a ghost liner, a type of manifestation of a heroic spirit. Gray puts up a decent resistance, enough to make the woman want to train her had they met under better circumstances. As a reward, the woman offers to show her something. The woman has heterochromia, eyes of different colors, and while staring Waver down, she activates her mystic eye of compulsion. She had hoped to make Waver fight his own disciple, but thankfully his glasses block the effect. Gray, on the other hand, is compelled by the eyes, striking back at her master. Before she can behead Waver, though, Gray activates the mana stored in the scythe to flood her magic circuits and regain control. With the woman's plan failed, she draws her sword, gathers mana into it, and slams it down. Gray tries to absorb all this energy, but her body rejects the sheer volume. Surrounded by a surge of lightning, the woman summons a two-horse chariot, one that Waver immediately recognizes. More specifically, he recognizes the chariot, but what he expects to be bulls drawing it are instead draconic skeletons. The woman declares herself Hephaestion, the closest friend of the King of Conquerors, while activating her noble phantasm, Gordius Wheel. Gray grabs Waver and jumps into the air to protect him, but the assault doesn't stop. The chariot continues to charge them, surging with lightning all around. Gray attempts to fight back by chanting the awakening for Rongo Miniad, but Waver tells her to stop, since they're in an unstable location that could get them all killed. Instead, Waver stands his ground, pulling out the knife he uses to cut his cigars. The chariot and its lightning come to trample him, but at the very last second, both he and Gray are saved by Cowlus. Sensing the dense electricity, Cowlus came to their aid, bringing along one of the primeval batteries they replicated. Instead of facing the chariot head-on, Gray and Waver are instead blasted back to the rear door where they escape. Hephaestion doesn't pursue, which Waver assumes is an indication that she isn't trying to pick a fight with the rail Zeppelin itself. Gray is still confused about how they survived, but then she notices a lock missing from Waver's hair. He explains that female magi would sometimes fill their hair with mana for emergencies, and he took up the idea for defense. It was more practical than relying on mystic codes. Thus, both the primeval battery and Waver's hair were used to divert the chariot's charge, letting the wind it generated push them to safety. On the verge of passing out, Waver wonders how Iskandar could have such a close friend that he never saw through the Ionian Hetairoi. With his coat totally scorched, he loses consciousness after telling Gray and Cowlus not to tell the staff about what just happened. Heeding his request, they bring Waver back to his room and, without adequate medical supplies, do their best to separate the torched fabric from his burnt skin. While Cowlus doesn't specialize in healing, there is one application for the primeval batteries that helps. Electricity can stimulate Waver's natural healing ability while replenishing his ode. For a time, Cowlus follows this treatment, leaving Gray nothing to do but cry kneeled beside her master. Olga watches on, asking whether the person who attacked Waver is the same person who killed Trisha, but they have no way of knowing that just yet. Gray isn't technically a Magus, so Olga doesn't understand why she cares so much about Waver. Regardless, Olga can see Gray's sorrow and offers up a bottle of druidic medicine originally meant for Trisha. Applying the panacea like an ointment to Waver's back helps keep him stable. Nonetheless, Gray finds herself begging to God, praying to help him survive. She wakes up in the morning with a blanket draped over her shoulders. The druidic medicine did its job, and Waver will pull through given time. Olga comes back, claiming she didn't think the medicine would have actually worked, and assumes Cowlus is some kind of idiot genius for being able to pull it off with electric magecraft he learned only a few weeks prior. As thanks for the medicine, Gray and Cowlus trust Olga by telling her what happened last night. It's concerning that someone was able to summon a servant outside the Fuyuki Grail Wars. It shouldn't be possible. Borrowing a hero's power is one thing, but straight-up summoning a heroic spirit needs a ritual as complex as the Greater Grail. Nonetheless, someone did it, and Hephaestion's noble phantasm is proof of that. Olga points out that if there's a servant, that means it's likely there's a master also on board the train. When asked, she notes that Hephaestion is, indeed, Iskandar's most famous follower. The two of them studied at Mieza, taught by Aristotle. Each of them eventually got married to one of Darius III's daughters, but the servant they met last night was a woman. To that, Olga assumes that if Hephaestion is really a woman, then Iskandar probably lied about her gender to his generals, and more specific records just didn't survive to the modern day. Hearing all this, Gray feels a bit ashamed for not knowing things an 11-year-old considers obvious, even if Olga's a proper mage. Another famous part of Hephaestion's lore is that when she and Iskandar first visited Darius III, his mother couldn't tell which of them was the actual king and mistakenly bowed to Hephaestion. Iskandar found this hilarious, claiming that she's another Iskandar. The story seems a bit far-fetched assuming Hephaestion's a woman, but the idea still stands that she served as Iskandar's double, at least in title. Considering all this talk about Iskandar, Olga correctly guesses that Waver's crew is here to get back Iskandar's stolen catalyst, and reasons that the thief must have used it to summon Hephaestion. It makes sense the two of them would have a common connection to the same relic. What's odd here is that servants normally avoid using their true name, which I guess means Olga hasn't played much Fate Grand Order. Gray tries to contemplate everything that's happened up till now, and decides to ask Cowless what Waver meant when describing Trish's eyes as predictive. I already said it earlier, but there's a difference between knowing the future and knowing a possible future. Cowless describes it as a difference between predictive foresight and determinative foresight. In Trish's case, her eyes helped her gather tons of information and calculate all that information to make very educated guesses of what will happen next. Her visions aren't foolproof, since they require events play out as she anticipates based on prior trends. In order to have the more accurate, determinative foresight, you'd need some way of ensuring the prophesized future is guaranteed, which is a lot more like controlling fate itself. The mystic eyes of Ophelia and Musashi from Fate Grand Order are some examples that not only predict the future, but also eliminate other possibilities. We don't have this same distinction for visions of the past, though. The past is already fixed, at least relative to the present. If one were to go back in time, the past would cease to be the past, wouldn't it? That doesn't mean viewing the past is foolproof, though. Our visions of the past are essentially just records and memories, which can be unreliable. That said, when the culprit delivered a message under their door, Waver said they must be invisible to foresight and hindsight, invisible to time itself, since neither Karabo's memories nor Trish's eyes could detect the killer. Needing more information, Gray and Cowless plan to visit Yvette, since she's a lot more knowledgeable when it comes to these mystic eyes. Meanwhile, from within the front locomotive, Rodin and Leandra discuss the murders. Their number one priority is making sure the auctions go off without a hitch, so even though Trish's death is an inconvenience, it doesn't change their plans. Hell, assuming if the killer approached them wanting to transplant Trish's eyes, they'd be willing to perform the service. Furthermore, Hephaestion's attack wasn't directed at the train itself, so they feel no cause for concern on that front. What does grab their attention, however, is the appearance of a child of Einash. This comes out of left field, especially if you aren't into Tsukihime, but there's this one dead apostle called the Forest of Einash. It's a living forest that preys upon the victims who enter it, plus, the bloody fruit it produces can be used to spawn more vampiric forests called Children of Einash. Apparently, someone's tampered with Rail Zeppelin's tracks, growing one of these children along the route. At the same time, we have two smaller scenes. In one, Ishiri Adashino tries to piece together the murder, but there's nothing we haven't already mentioned. In the other scene, Jean Mario is busy giving Yvette a live performance of his TV show, Zombie Cooking. She is thoroughly entertained and tries to entice him into an alliance. She claims she isn't a threat, because even if they covet the same pair of mystic eyes, she'll be happy so long as she gets to study the winner for her family's research. The two of them think this is a great opportunity to combat the authority of Olga being the daughter of a lord. Karabo, on the other hand, wants no part of it, not even caring who winds up buying his eyes after he sells them. Everyone is interrupted with an announcement over the intercom informing them of a child of Einash on the tracks. The train plans to drive straight through the wicked forest, and they only warn the other passengers to protect themselves. Olga notices that it's snowing outside the window. As the train nears its new foe, a blizzard begins to form. Panicking from the impending danger, she declares she doesn't plan to ally with Gray or Cowless or anyone. Whatever debt she had to them was already repaid with her potion. She bolsters her confidence, declaring Trisha taught her how to fend for herself. Before going off on her own, she turns to Gray and Cowless to ask if they'll be able to keep Waver safe. The volume ends with an interlude, telling what's been going down with Rhinus back at the clock tower. She gets a sudden visit from Melvin Wines, whom she does business with. He bursts into Norwich's main building, vomiting up blood on his way to her office. With Waver gone, all of the administrative duties of being a lord fall to Rhinus, so she's not happy to have such a volatile guest. Melvin's upset because nobody told him that Waver was boarding Rail Zeppelin. Since Melvin is in charge of the el-melloi source crest, and Waver's body itself is their collateral, he declares he deserves to know these things. Oh, and because Waver's his good friend too, of course. Rhinus looks on at this complete spaz and finds it amazing how the history of the clock tower, and Magecraft itself, has been changed because he decided to pay for Waver's little trip to Macedonia. Without that experience, Waver may not have ever developed the skills and confidence needed to thrive as a professor. Melvin's frequent vomiting is written off as him having a weak body and poor health. Despite this, he is insistent on visiting the train, even if he has to go alone. His family's already gone through all the trouble of procuring an invitation, after all. Rhinus is concerned, because while Melvin is Waver's friend, he's not necessarily Waver's ally. The dude is a conniving prankster, so in order to keep him under her control, Rhinus agrees to join him. The volume ends with Melvin's helicopter coming to pick them up in the distance. Once again, Case Files has presented us with another two-part story, meaning that the rest of this arc continues on in Volume 5. Translation gets a bit rocky at that point, as Twilight's Call stopped pretty early on after the anime started airing. Nonetheless, I plan to pick up all the pieces, and make my next video in the series just as informative as the others. Look forward to it. Thanks for watching!
If you enjoy this channel, help us grow by liking, commenting, sharing the video, subscribing to OtakuDaiKun, and
most of all, smashing that notification bell so you don't miss out on all of our anime discussion, lore, or Let's Play content.
You can support us directly through Patreon, Subscribestar, or our YouTube membership, all of which come with benefits like exclusive vids and early access.
As always,
celebrate your fandom!
I want to give a special shout out to all my $10 and up supporters: VideoGamer75, Stephen Elak, Samuel Gersten, Otaku Mom, Jens Bauman, Mystic Samurai 1983, Lord Omagoden, Free Brick, RNGer Shuffles 1498, Alexis Yukio Gomez Yamato, Johnny Tsunami, Link Pendrago, Brandon Baker, Observer Bellis, Flash Daniel, Caitlin P, Vladimir Rovna, Normace, Jonathan Padua, The Taz 96, and SF Giants fan Mike. Thank you all so much.